Hi there, thanks for joining me for this short video. In this one we're going to look at one of our risk assessments that we have at the safety shop, and the risk assessments that we're going to be looking at are those that are typically required in a lot of different businesses. They may be general risk assessments or ones that are specific to particular environments and types of workplaces. In this case, we're going to look at the work at height one, which you may have already guessed from the thumbnail. This is one of the first types of these videos that we've done, and I want to just let you know we're not going to look over all of the risk assessment as such. I'm going to just take 2 or 3 elements out of the risk assessment in no particular order or order of priority as such, but just elements that I feel are maybe useful to look at and look at a bit of the detail behind them, just to give you a flavour of the types of things that may be included in this type of risk assessment if you are needing to do one yourself, and hopefully it will be helpful for you to get those cogs turning and get you thinking about the right things. Just before you continue, we do have this risk assessment template available at safety.com, and I will leave some links below for you to access that if you do wish. You can buy it in our shop if it's something that you'll find useful. But let's crack on. So this is what our risk assessment for work at height example looks like on the surface. What we're going to do is just pick a section here. So the first section I want to look at now, which you'll see clipped on screen, is the mobile access equipment section. If you've been watching our YouTube live videos recently, you may have seen me discussing mobile access equipment, or MUPs, as you can see in the hazards identified section here. Mobile access equipment does of course cover quite a plethora of different things, including mobile towers, as you can see there, scaffolds, those working platforms, and so on, that are motorized. So yes, it does cover a large area. In that sense then, for a work at height risk assessment, you will certainly want to cover this in most circumstances thoroughly. So let's just look at this and kind of things that are included in it then. So first of all, and again, if you've been watching, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but if you've been watching the YouTube lives, we've been picking up on learning points on each HSE prosecution that we've been reviewing, and I will be repeating some of the stuff that I would have mentioned in those videos. But the first thing at the top of the line here, as you can see, is that only competent and fully trained people should be able to use the equipment when it comes to things like scaffolds, mobile platforms, towers, and so on. Hopefully for most people that isn't a surprise. That also goes for the inspection of it as well. We looked at an HSE prosecution on our YouTube live earlier today that actually picked out a case where someone was even acting as a banksman and ended up getting injured. And they weren't trained to even perform that duty, and subsequently the company was fined £400,000 in court, and a lot of liability was sort of pushed in the company's direction. So that just shows you what can happen if people aren't properly trained. So that's a big point. Going on from that then, it sort of mentions different maybe types of training, industry bodies and things, like PASMA, for example, there for mobile towers, or IPAF for mobile platforms. There are, depending on where you're located, there hopefully may be industry bodies in place there to provide you with a suitable level of training for the different pieces of plant and equipment that you might be using for your working at height. As it says there, again, this isn't prescriptive. This is just an example and some ideas that you may include, or to give you a starting point for your work at height risk assessment. It does mention a banksman should be assisting the operator at all times here. That may or may not be the case depending on your decisions and how your environment is set up and all the other aspects that impact the risk when it comes to working at height. but obviously that's suggested here. What else can we see? We're talking as well about things like fall arrest systems, fall arrest systems are very important if you are using, anything particularly mobile. Also, it does apply if you're working at height on somewhere where there isn't adequate guarding. For example, if you're on a roof and there isn't any guardrails around the edges, for example, you will want to consider fall arrest equipment. That's a major aspect of work at height risk assessment as well. Other aspects that are touched on that are very important when it comes to planning the working at height, again, particularly when you're using mobile equipment or even towers and moving them around a site. So things like weather conditions, ground conditions, looking at as well exclusion zones for the operation of your equipment to make sure nobody is in the vicinity of where you're operating, or at least if they are, that there's adequate safeguards in place to make sure that they're kept out of the way of harm. What else can we see there then? So we're kind of touching on most of the points. The one of the last points there, which is a very important aspect, again, if you're using lifting equipment here, you should understand and make sure that you have the knowledge of the safe working loads of your lifting equipment. Make sure that they're never exceeded according to the guidelines of whoever has manufactured that, or regulatory guidelines where applicable. Other things that you want to include there when it comes to towers, scaffolds and so on, and plant as well, is just having your daily inspections. So that's something that is very much part and parcel of using this type of equipment here in the UK, but depending on where you are, you may have different rules and expectations for that, but that is the standard would be a pre-use inspection for those types of equipment here. As it says there, if there is an issue with it, the important thing is that it's isolated, tagged, and made sure that people are aware that it shouldn't be used until any issues can be rectified. So plenty to think about there when it comes to mobile access equipment, as you can see. Hopefully that gives you a few things to think about if this isn't something you've tackled before. Going on to the next point then, and this is, I suppose, somewhat a continuation of the previous point, and this is to do with the unplanned release of materials from height. And I want to just touch on this one because it is quite an important point when we are moving materials, working with materials, moving them up and down, using mobile plant and so on, in this type of construction style environment, or where we're doing maintenance works and so on. Obviously, if something does fall from a height, it doesn't take very much for there to be severe consequences and injury potential with any sort of material or tools as well. If you were to drop it from a height, obviously the higher it is, the worse that risk becomes. So looking at that and the control measures that we have in place for that, things like debris netting, if we're using scaffolds, and mast climbers are referred to in this one. Mast climbers, if you're not aware, I'll throw a picture up on screen. It's a mobile, more of a fixed platform. It's mobile, goes up and down the side of buildings to allow for installation of things like cladding, windows and so on. Evidently, if you're using large materials or tools on this type of platform, you want to make sure that these tools or materials don't fall down onto the unsuspecting public or other workers below. So it's very important you get the management of that correct. The other thing to consider is if you're working at, on a high-rise building, for example, if something does fall, and it's a windy day and it's partial to catching a gust of wind, it can be blown outside of exclusion zones or outside of areas that you have controlled below the equipment. So that's something to bear in mind, and the consequences then may be somewhat unpredictable. So it's very important to make sure that the materials and the tools are very closely managed. In terms of tools, you might want to use things like tool tethers, very common in construction nowadays, to make sure that those don't fall from a height. If you imagine dropping a hammer from 50 or 100 feet, you can imagine just the damage that could potentially do if it does hit someone. So it's something to be very much aware of. So that's another one. I don't think I want to just go too any more deep on that one. It's self-explanatory, and as I say, more of a continuation of the previous point. But something, if you are doing a working at height risk assessment, that sometimes people won't necessarily pick up on that risk. A lot of the focus is typically upon preventing falls, which is naturally, the case and something that you should focus on. But we also need to make sure that we do consider the material storage and the control of tools as well. Okay, so the last point I want to touch on here is personal protective equipment. Again, we're not really taking the most important points necessarily here from the risk assessment. It's just a few different ones in the context of this type of assessment to give you an idea of what may be important for you and why it's important in this context. So for personal protective equipment, in a lot of risk assessments, the PPE, as it's known as the last line of defense within health and safety, it shouldn't be your first mechanism for controlling risk, but it usually does have somewhat of a part to play. When it comes to working at height, the use of protective equipment is very important, and this is why I want to just chat about it here. So we've already talked about tool tethers. With that type of thought process in mind, we'd also want to maybe consider if we're wearing hard hats, as you can see mentioned here, that the hard hat is fixed or strapped onto the operatives or the workers when they're working at height to make sure that doesn't fall. So anything at all that could be loose, you want to make sure that's secure, including our PPE. But the big one here for us at working at height is really the fall arrest equipment. When it comes to people that are working in areas where there is a risk of a fall, for example, if there's guardrails but there's still a risk of someone perhaps falling over the top of the guardrail, or if there's areas that are exposed and the work has to be carried out with those edges exposed and no control measure can be put in place, we want to have some sort of restriction or catch mechanism to stop any fall being a severe issue. Essentially, the two main categories that we usually talk about here are arrest and prevention. So if we're talking about fall arrest, that's something that's stopping you from falling any further than you've already fell as such. So you may be able to fall out of a basket of a mobile platform, but the fall arrest system will only allow you to fall, for example, for a couple of meters with some sort of shock absorption, and then allow you to be rescued or lowered to the ground, for example. When we're talking about fall prevention equipment, those are typically things like safety lines or restrictive equipment that doesn't allow the operator to go far enough to actually fall over the side of a building, over the top of a piece of plant or whatever it may be. So two different, slightly different applications. One's focused on prevention, the other is just arresting that fall. Both ultimately preventing, hopefully, severe injury, really, and that's what we're looking for. It does say here just as well, there is a really important aspect. If you are using lanyards, ropes, any lifting accessories or fall arrest equipment accessories should be checked on a 6 monthly basis. That's the UK standard here under LOLR. Also, as well as that, there should be a strict inspection regime which is called out here as well, and you typically want to have some sort of recording mechanism for that as part of your daily operations, and then somebody can hopefully, whether that's a supervisor, manager or health and safety person, just check that that's being done, just to make sure that if, for example, a rope was damaged, no one is going up using ropes for their safety, or, for example, harnesses that have been significantly damaged and therefore undermining the performance of that piece of safety equipment. What else here then? Just regular PPE stuff, really, such as making sure that the equipment that is issued to people is on a register or recorded somewhere. That's more important here in this sense, just because if there was a fall from height, for example, and someone was to claim that a piece of essential safety equipment wasn't issued to them, it's important for the business to have a record to say that it was, of course, if that is the case. And that's where the PPE Register really comes in to play here, and is an asset for the business. Anything else there? Other aspects of PPE are really more general, so we don't really want to touch on those too much here. I will leave a link to our work at height decision making tool that we have on the safety.com website, that's based on the HSE's decision making guidance when it comes to working at height. Hopefully you can use that to help you walk through step by step the decision making process when it comes to selecting your equipment and control measures when working at height. That is a lot of the time the difficult part for people, just trying to ascertain, are you controlling the risk enough, or do you have to go further? Have you considered all of the available options and so on, and done that in a methodical and logical fashion? So hopefully that link to that resource on our website will be helpful. And depending on when you're watching this as well, we will be releasing a working at height online course, and the video will be posted on YouTube as well if you want to use it for yourself or for training others, just to talk through the main aspects of the risk around working at height, how to control it, and so on. So do keep an eye out for that. As soon as that's published, we will put a link up on this video itself. Just to remind you, we do have this template and other resources available at the safety.com website. You may find the links in the description, and also, depending on when you're watching this, there may be links on the screen as well that you can click on to show you some options there in terms of what you can download from our shop. So hopefully that's been helpful for you. Do let us know if you have any questions. We're very much wanting to engage with you here and answer questions related to this subject matter. It's a very important aspect when it comes to workplace health and safety still. Today, working at height is the number one cause of fatalities in the UK, which I've touched on in some of our YouTube live HSE prosecution videos, and it's really important that we get it right. Thanks for joining me for this one. Hopefully I'll see you again in the next video. All the best.